cool.
Pressure.
Hey,
So I mean, this is just what our life is like. Actually,
we just hang out with massive LED panel lights and ring lights and new background. So what we're doing is kind of a soft launch here, and if you're watching, give us some feedback about whether you're getting good audio and visual, and then we'll kind of go properly live in about a minute.
We are accelerating the sophistication of our technology stack.
Because we're accelerationists.
That's right. For Jeffrey's stream and for mine. So as we slowly kind of increase the sophistication of our operation, we need to be reflective and make sure everything's working.
And I've got a bigger T-Rex, which represents the likely extinction risk of academia as a profession.
Also, I'm becoming a transhumanist soy boy. I don't want this to get out to my enemies, but I don't actually ever drink this. I've had Soylent one other time in my life. I just saw this at the Walmart, and it has caffeine and theanine.
This is not paid product placement, by the way.
No, we are not being sponsored right now.
Yet.
Although, Soylent, reach out if you want to. Although I don't think I'd be a very good...
Call me maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm getting some background hum.
Yeah.
I think that might be from the computer fan.
No, it's not close to the mic, so I would doubt it. I could turn the gain down probably.
Yeah.
But a little background hum is that's no big deal. I would be more concerned about like lag issues.
Yeah. Let's see.
If like
how's the hum?
Yeah, let me ask that.
I would be concerned about audio. The real threat would be the video and audio are out of sync, or if it's like stuttering badly. But yeah, these are always chock full of like mad stuff. But isn't there something where like your body actually doesn't absorb most of it, right? Like they can pump this stuff full of 25% daily dose of like every possible vitamin, but most of that gets passed through, doesn't it?
I don't think it's very bioavailable.
Right.
No, they're saying it's better, so it's good.
Better
okay.
from what?
Does that sound better?
Yeah, it's probably the gain was up a little bit.
It's like being on the Enterprise. That's a good thing, right?
We got
AP Sync is good. And
Let's
thank you guys for giving feedback, because like we don't know.
It's like being on the Enterprise.
And what do you think of the new background? It's desert themed, because we are in the desert. This is not technically New Mexico. This is Joshua Tree in California, but it's like New Mexico. It's really similar.
Yeah, this is like the backyard of your house, pretty much.
Anyway.
In fact, that's a window behind us that you're looking through.
I think we're good to go when you are.
Cool.
Augmented reality. Okay. Hi, welcome if you're watching. So today I'm with Justin Murphy, political scientist. I'm Jeffrey Miller, psychologist. And we're both guys who have kind of one foot in academia and one foot in social media. And we're going to be talking about academia versus social media as sort of career tracks and platforms and income sources for independent-minded thinkers. And we've had different experiences, but I think we both have, some knowledge of these contrasting areas.
And we're both very interested in this.
And
we talk about this all the time.
Yeah, we're passionate. Justin and his wife live in my house, and we talk quite a bit about the future of intellectual activity and the sharing of ideas and the nature of research and the future of all of that. And I also give advice to a lot of undergrads and grad students about their career plans. Should I go to grad school at all? Should I learn big data? Should I go to med school, whatever. So if you're young and you're thinking about different possible career tracks, you have some intellectual passion for some particular domain, but you're thinking ahead, what is the future realistically going to hold for me if I go one route or another? I hope this live stream will be interesting. So a little bit of backstory. Both Justin and I did our PhDs in America. We both have quite a bit of experience with British academia. I worked in England for 9 years. So I taught and did research at University of Sussex, University of Nottingham, University College London, London School of Economics. And Justin worked for a number of years, 5 years, University
Six
University of Southampton in political science. I worked mostly in psychology, game theory, evolutionary robotics, stuff like that. I've also worked 1 year in German academia, sort of, at a Max Planck Institute, which is a research kind of think tank, and a year in an Australian research lab. So I'd like to bring in a little bit of an international perspective to this as well, because some trends that are happening in other countries are a little bit ahead of America in certain ways, and vice versa in other ways. And I think we also both have kind of a love-hate relationship with academia. So it's been very good to us in certain ways, like credentials that give us a little bit more of a voice and a platform, and giving us kind of a decent, more or less livable income, at least for a certain number of years. But we're also acutely aware of the many foibles and quirks and downsides and limitations and constraints on free speech in academia. And I think we're also both worried about what does the future hold. Obviously, social media itself is not static. YouTube, Twitter, Facebook will not necessarily be the dominant social media forms in 10 years. Things like Patreon or monetizing YouTube videos or ebooks or other kind of income streams are very, very likely to change in the next decade or two. But academia is also bound for big changes. So just because you're 22 now and thinking about going to grad school, you should not take movie depictions of academic life back in the 50s or the 80s as necessarily indicating what you're going to live as your kind of career experience, right? So let me just lay out the timeline, and then maybe we can get into a little discussion. So if you're 22 now in 2019, it'll typically take, even if you apply immediately to grad school, even if you don't become an RA and you get more lab experience and letters of recommendation, if you go to grad school right away, it'll typically take 5 to 7 years before you get your PhD. You'll typically be facing about another 2 to 3 years of doing postdoc work before you're viable for an assistant professor job. So that's about another decade, right? So that brings us forward to about 2029, 2030. Then let's say you luck out. You're one of the small minority of graduating PhDs and postdocs who get a tenure track job. Well, then you've got 6 years of working hard to get tenure. The British system's a little bit different, but and the time scale is a little accelerated in Britain. But basically then you're looking at about 2035 to 2040 before you get tenure as an academic. And then another 30 years maybe of active working life, assuming we don't have regenerative medicine that prolongs that another century. So you might not retire, till 2070, 2080. Ask yourself this serious question. What is the likelihood that universities as we know them will still be around in 2050, 2060, 2070? Or will they be replaced through economic, political, intellectual forces by quite a different way of doing the stuff that universities do, which is mostly teaching, mentoring future professors, and doing research, mostly federally funded and a little bit privately funded. So I think it's important to be epistemically humble about the future and what it will bring when you're doing your career planning. So that's kind of what this live stream is about, is it's particularly for young people or kind of mid-career people thinking, am I happy with academia? Do I want to stay in it? Or do I want to try to get into it and do kind of a midlife PhD? Or do I want to jump ship? And maybe some of you watching this are probably in grad school, you're doing postdocs, and you might be thinking, is this really viable? Or do I want to think about doing something else? And if so, what would that be? What do I do? So that's my little intro to this, and I'm sure Justin has some further thoughts.
That was a good setup. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts. I mean, we could attack this from any number of different angles. People should definitely ask questions if they want to steer the conversation. I mean, one thing that immediately comes to my mind, which I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on, although I don't recall if we've ever talked about it, is how conditional this sort of question is on personality traits. I feel like that's something that has become increasingly clear to me in my trajectory, I kind of just realized that actually my strengths and weaknesses were not well suited to academia. They were good enough that I got pretty far and did quite well, but my personality traits were such that I wasn't thriving in academia. I should also be a little bit more blunt about who I am and where I'm coming from. I just quit academia basically. So Jeffrey said we both have like a foot in and a foot out. I pretty much have both my feet out, although I'm, still a kind of academically inclined type of person, and I'm still doing, what I like to think of as highbrow kind of academic research and writing. I'm fully out of academia, just for so people are aware, and so that will probably color some of the differences of viewpoint that Jeffrey and I might have. And for me, it was a large part of it was realizing that while I could have had a permanent job for life in academia and done okay, I wasn't going to crack the top 1% of social scientists. I'm pretty smart, but I'm not super smart. I'm pretty conscientious, but I'm not super conscientious, able to just crank out papers after papers that of stuff that's like actually quite arcane and kind of boring to me. But I'm extremely high in extroversion, in specifically aspect enthusiasm. And so that allows me to, for instance, make a shitload of interesting videos about topics that I'm interested in. I could do that. I could do 4 of those a day, every day of the week, and that's fun for me. And I can excel at doing that sort of thing. And I sort of just started to realize that, especially in today's economy, to really be great at anything, you have to, I think, go where your unique strengths and weaknesses are best, kind of reflected. And that was part of the calculus that was behind my decision to make a radical break from academia and go all in as a kind of full-time internet intellectual, just because I felt like my unique temperamental constitution would give me some real edges in being able to do that, whereas I actually had some personality traits that were a bit of a liability in academia. So I wonder if you thought about that very much, or if you have anything to add on just the personality conditional nature of this question.
Absolutely, yeah. So when I taught my psychology of effective altruism class, which our audiovisual engineer actually took, I put a lot of emphasis on career choice. We had a whole week discussion about this, and I really strongly encouraged my students to check out the 80,000hours.org website, which does great kind of career advice and self-evaluation for young people thinking, what do I do? And it involves a lot of this issue of trying to find an optimal match between your individual differences variables and your likely career track. So the main variables are what I call the central 6, which is the big 5 personality traits and your general intelligence. So you really need to have a sober, accurate analysis of how smart am I really, and how much intelligence do different career tracks require, So if you want to be like a tech entrepreneur, that really requires a massive amount of G, the G factor, raw general intelligence. The big 5 personality traits, academia is particularly demanding on conscientiousness and willpower and self-control and motivation and sustained just hard work and grinding it out through grad school and postdoc and pre-tenure. It's not particularly demanding on extroversion. Like, you can be a pretty introverted professor, and most introverted professors learn to teach well enough to do okay. Openness to experience. There's kind of an optimal degree of openness in academia. Like, you want to be kind of open to new ideas, but not
Too
always
open.
going off in new directions. Particularly, it's important to be sensitive to local social and intellectual taboos. Agreeableness. Doesn't matter a whole lot. You can be kind of a fairly disagreeable academic. You can be a super agreeable academic. The only thing that really predicts is basically your salary. If you're willing to move frequently, that's kind of a disagreeable trait, but it buys you a lot. If you're willing to threaten to leave, if you're willing to negotiate and bargain hard in jobs, that buys you something.
Although I think the culture wars are kind of putting more of a premium on agreeableness. Would you
That's
agree with
true.
that?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting to think about that.
So if you're just an ornery guy like me and you don't take kindly to people telling you what to do or think, then 20, 30 years ago, that was not much of a problem in academia.
Right.
But increasingly, there is a premium on agreeableness with, when you apply for an academic job, for example, you're expected to write 3 things: research statement, what you work on; teaching statement, what you've taught, how you teach, what you want to teach; and then your EDI, your equity, diversity, and inclusion statement, right? Which is about how do you support the dominant social lefty progressive values of academia. This is typically required. If your EDI statement doesn't align with what universities want, you will not be hired probably, and that's the current reality. So if you're disagreeable and you're like, I don't want to write an EDI statement promoting diversity as my principal academic value, that will be a real handicap in terms of getting a job and tenure and promotion. And then neuroticism, right? The 5th of the big 5 traits. It's important to be realistic with yourself about how neurotic are you, where neurotic means you have a propensity for depression and anxiety and worrying. A lot of grad students have this. Grad school is relatively unstructured. It feeds neuroticism in a lot of ways. And a lot of people just kind of burn out and drop out of academia because they don't have the kind of emotional stability and sort of dogged determination to succeed and to take care of yourself mentally and physically in the ways that you need to do.
Although, do you think there's a kind of type that can make their neuroticism work for them in academia? I feel like I've known a few like that.
Yeah, I mean, of course, in the run-up to tenure, I was completely freaking out about how much I had to publish, to make a good case for getting tenure at my university. And I worked insanely hard. And the year before I went up for tenure, I published literally 12 journal papers. I've never been as productive before or since.
Right.
And that was neuroticism driven to some degree.
Right.
But if I'd had a little bit more neuroticism, it would have frozen me.
Right.
And I wouldn't have been able to actually produce.
I think a little dose of neuroticism can really help with the bureaucratic tasks and pressures, because I'm blessed with a relatively positive disposition. I'm not too neurotic. And I remember in my 6 years in academia, I often noted a difference between the people who, it's like they had an intrinsic motivation to do meaningless bureaucracy because not doing it made them nervous. It made them feel just worried and anxious if they didn't get that obscure, meaningless piece of paper in on time.
Yeah.
It caused them anxiety, and so it made them do it. And in a weird way, that makes it easier to do these different types of tasks. Whereas if you're actually really low in neuroticism, it sometimes can be hard to motivate for relatively obscure, inconsequential things. Is that fair to say, do you think?
Yeah, and some of the apparently obscure things aren't quite as obscure as you think. So, for example, I'm head of the colloquium committee, which means I organize our speaker series in my department. And I get really neurotic about that. Like, I really like to have that scheduled in advance. And when I introduce speakers, I get extremely nervous if I don't have a printout, verbatim of how to introduce them and do a good job when the other faculty and all the grad students are there. So that's, having that kind of selective neuroticism is quite useful. But I think that's true of any job that requires interacting with people and doing formal duties and committee work and meeting deadlines. And
right. Like, I just didn't really give a shit about a lot of that stuff, and I had, like, kind of dangerously low concern for how I was perceived and what people thought, so it's like, to me, if it wasn't intrinsically meaningful, like if, a little caveat here also is that the British system, I think, has much more kind of obscure, meaningless, inconsequential paperwork and kind of charades of...
Yeah, if you love irrational paperwork, you will love British academia.
Yeah, so my experience is colored by that, and maybe it's not so bad in your experience, but I never really felt any kind of concern or worry about, like, for instance, we had to do open days, for instance, all of the time. And at different
what's an open day?
When the students come and prospective students come, and you have to kind of show up and meet and greet and stuff like that. So basically, I mean, for any of you pursuing an academic career, different types of universities and different types of appointments within those universities are going to give you very different loads of work of different types. So Jeffrey and I have had very different trajectories. In an ideal world, most of you want to have a kind of pure research-based job at a prestigious American university where you're not asked to do too much in terms other than research and some basic teaching. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you might be at a small university, especially if it's somewhere in Britain. Britain tends to be much more like this, where they basically have you do all kinds of bureaucratic tasks of the widest variety. So just as one example, we would do things like open days where we had to do a little bit of work meeting and greeting students and doing that kind of front-facing, kind of customer service type of marketing type of function. And I mean, I didn't get into academia for that. I couldn't care less, and I just can't really pretend to care about certain things. And also, it was one of those things where like all big institutions, they have you do things that are not actually rational for even the purpose. Of course, I want the success of the university. I want what's good for the kids, the students. So of course, I care about those things. But academia will have you do many things that everyone knows. It's an open secret. This has actually no positive impact on anything whatsoever.
It's kind of just super conscientious virtue signaling.
Exactly. And so this is the reason I'm going into this, is because it's really important. You have to have the Constitution that makes you want to do those things anyway. Because if you're like me, and if you can see and everyone agrees that something is useless, for my type of personality, it's very hard to even muster the energy to do it, to even keep up appearances. And so that's something to be aware of. If you have a hard time keeping up appearances, academia might not be for you.
Yeah. So I think it's worth talking about at some point the big picture economically and kind of socially and technologically of these different career paths. I think it's also important to talk about some of the variety both within academia in terms of career tracks you can have, and sort of ways of approaching academia as a way of doing what you want intellectually and also being able to make it sort of decent living, and also variation within the social media track of ways to approach that. Okay, so a sort of mainstream academic career track where you're heading for full professor as soon as you can get it, so that you can maximize income and status and impact, right? Typically, at least in the social sciences and the hard sciences, means you're going to need to find great mentors, great collaborators, build up a network of people you work with, share data with, share ideas with, go to a lot of conferences, and you'll end up, as an assistant professor trying to get tenure, building up your lab group, right? Which is your little group of, let's say, 4 to 10 PhD students working with you, a gaggle of undergraduate research assistants. You're going to be applying for grants from federal agencies. You're going to sometimes get grants from companies or foundations or nonprofits, but mostly you will be suckling at the teat of the federal government, and the federal priorities for research will have a massive effect on how you can support your lab group, right? Because it's not just about supporting you and giving you travel money and summer salary. It's about making it so your grad students actually earn a living wage. And so your lab is flourishing and has the equipment and the budget and the staff that it needs. So that is kind of a big science approach, and it's increasingly the thing that you're under pressure to do. So you might think, oh, I just want to be a professor and, read cool books in my library and write on my computer.
Yeah, that's over.
No, that's
totally
largely over. You are going to have to basically be an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur. You're going to have to run a group of people you're accountable to 5 or 6 days a week, and you're going to have to spend most of your time writing grant proposals, thinking about budgets, managing people, adjudicating conflicts, writing, and then off to the side there's a little bit of time for teaching and teaching prep. My colleagues who do this, the amount of time they actually have to read a book or think about something hard in a sustained and serious way is negligible.
Let alone something new also.
Yeah, let alone getting into a new area.
Right.
Or going, oh, hey, maybe like game theory is relevant to this issue. I should go learn game theory. Well, you might have to wait for a sabbatical in 5 years to do that. Now, I've taken a different approach to academia, which is I haven't tried to maximize grant income. My lab group has typically been small, like 1 to 4 grad students at the most. I don't hire staff. I don't want to run a group. And that is very handicapping in terms of A, getting offers from other universities, and B, getting promotion and tenure and promotion to full professor. And that's fine. That's a conscious choice I've made. I just didn't want to run a group like that. You can succeed in doing that if you're very smart and you have good ideas and you write papers that have an impact, that get cited, and you go to conferences and you give awesome conference talks. So it is possible to do that, but it's increasingly really, really difficult to even get a tenure-track job if you haven't gotten at least a moderate-sized grant of $50,000 to $100,000. Okay, so that's the reality, that universities depend on your grant income as a sort of research entrepreneur, as a professor, to cover the running expenses of the university. And you have to realize that universities will look at you first as a generator of grant income, and only secondarily as an intellectual or researcher, or the quality or novelty of your ideas. So you have to realize that universities are almost all under enormous economic pressure. They're not getting the support from states, if they're a public university, that they've historically gotten. They're not getting the tuition income that they were getting 10 years ago, because students are kind of figuring out this credential factory is not necessarily good value. And that's the student debt crisis, right? So you need to think about all this, and also what direction are these trends going? Are universities going to get richer in 10 or 20 years? Are they going to get more federal or state support? Are they going to be able to double tuition that students have to pay? I doubt it. So that's kind of the economic macro context for some of these issues.
Yeah, I would also add another variable that people don't often think of in economic terms, but you should think of it in economic terms, which is status as a form of payment. Because typically, traditionally, you have to understand that academics are paid in part through status. Most academics who are currently tenured, let's say, could make much more money on the open market. They choose to do academia instead, historically, because it's noble. It's seen as especially kind of admirable, and it has a kind of mystique to it. A mystique of not just nobility, but of disinterested kind of dedication to the truth and to the public interest. And because of this kind of historical glow or aura around, the professor, that is part of what you're paid in, essentially. When you become a professor, you're choosing to take a little bit less money than you would to enjoy the experience of getting that respect and that deference and that appreciation from people. The reason that's important to think about economically is because this is something we were talking about the other day. It's one of my firmly held hypotheses. I really do think this, that status payment is decreasing objectively over time due to institutional dynamics, essentially. I think the fact is that academics command less respect. That needs to be qualified. What I mean by that is that the respect that academics do command is increasingly fragmented. So many of you will be aware that over the past several years, the conservative half of the population, for instance, has become increasingly cool towards academia, increasingly mistrustful and contemptuous of the entire academy itself and the professor as such. So you have to think about that. That's half of the country actually, each passing year, cares less and less about you